our guest speaker today is a tremendous leader in economic development strategy. She's recognized as a trailblazer, too, on reinforcing tourism as that vital component of a community's economic development strategy. She recently completed her term as the chair of Destination Marketing Association International, only the third female chair in the organization's history, by the way. She chaired DMAI's Future Studies, the DMO Blueprint. She served on the inaugural Destination Marketing Accreditation Program Board. She has developed curriculum for the association's program in destination management and leads several courses at its conferences and other industry forums. She has earned the industry's highest educational certification, Fellow Certified Destination Management Executive. And we're delighted she's with us today. I also found out as I was visiting with her earlier, like myself, she's half Italian, so you know she's good. May I introduce Maura Guest.
Thank you, Dino, or as we say it in the old country, thank you, Dino. Thank you very much. All righty. How are you guys? We good? Sounds good? We can hear me? Lunch has not quite lulled us into that peaceful sleep. If you do, I saw a major sugar fix in front of everybody, so dive in, please do. I do want to thank you all for inviting me here. Stephen, thanks for trusting me with your family, your peeps, your bosses. Dangerous, very dangerous thing to do. Got kind of concerned earlier this week when I got my Google alert, like every good news executive does, and saw that the article about your annual meeting had made the Norman transcript with the headline, "Excessively Thorny Roses, Sign of Disease." I thought there might be more to the article. Perhaps there was a gardening show coming to town, but no, it was strictly about my speech. And I just typed a little note back to the paper and said, am I the excessively thorny rose? Or would I be the disease? I'll just let y'all judge when we get to the end of the story, okay? But thank you all for being here. And thanks for including me in something that's so important to all of us. This week and today in particular, all around the country, destinations big and small are celebrating their hometowns and recognizing an industry that collectively represents 1 out of every 9 jobs in the United States, an industry that's among the country's leading industries. Collectively, we're larger than the auto industry. We're this country's #1 export, and we represent almost 3% of our country's total gross domestic product. I always think context is really, really important in understanding how the CVB side of our industry came to be, and then in better understanding the role we play back here in the community. And then in thinking about collectively how the community works with us, and us with the community, working together to move our destinations forward. So with the context of the impact of the national travel industry in front of you, I'd like you to come with me on a bit of a magical history tour that'll take us through some of our industry's past, an understanding of how things changed along the way, and hopefully provide some food for thought for you and for all of you in this room as you collectively plan for Norman's future. There were really 3 key factors that led to our industry as we know it today and to the CVB side of the profession. And coupled with some amazing similarities to what's going on in our world right now and actually has been for the past 5 or 7 years, they're worth paying attention to. One was the Industrial Revolution and the growth of large manufacturing organizations caused by the many technological innovations of that age. The second was the growth of the railroad and ultimately the highway system here in the U.S. And the third was the Panic of 1893. This whole idea of associations has historically been a very American concept, this idea of like-minded people wanting to gather together, like you all here today. But those gatherings came to be known as conventions, and when you think about it, there have been meetings and conventions going on in this country really since the beginning of our recorded time. Think about this country's very beginnings, including the Boston Tea Party, the First Continental Congress, and every political gathering since then. Here in the U.S., though, this idea of associations really came into its own, and it wasn't just the national parties gathering every 4 years to nominate their candidates, but other organizations that were finding the need to bring people together to meet and to discuss ideas and issues of common interest. In fact, prior to the Civil War, there's record of the Writing Paper Manufacturers Association and the National Education Association. The American Medical Association was formed in 1847. The American Bar Association held its first meeting in 1878. But until the late 1880s, however, folks that met in organized gatherings were, for the most part, religious, abolitionists, former military, political, social, educational groups, in addition to those folks attending agricultural fairs. Meetings in those days were very limited by the size of the lodging available in a particular place, so if it was a larger meeting, they tended to be housed in tents and attracted people who didn't mind camping out. Civil War veterans, lawyers, doctors, or political groups met at churches, educational facilities, or town halls. The numbers attending were relatively small, their need for a place to stay limited by the duration of the meeting, their willingness to travel limited by the time it took to get anywhere, their ability to hear limited by the number of people that could hear the speaker's voice since there wasn't any amplification at the time. The reasons for different types of people to meet in person were relatively few, and much of the meetings followed the agricultural cycle. You couldn't think of leaving home until after the crops were planted or harvested. The need to see somebody or something was limited by travel time and discretionary time and income. For us here in the United States, there were many uniquely American reasons for the idea of meeting in convention. In 1831, Alexis de Tocqueville observed in his book, Democracy in America, the Americans of all ages, all conditions, and all dispositions constantly form associations. They have not only commercial and manufacturing companies in which all take part, but associations of 1,000 other kinds: religious, moral, serious, feudal, restricted, enormous, or diminutive. The Americans make associations to give entertainments, to found establishments for education, to send missionaries to the Antipodes. You see, unlike our European counterparts at the time, Americans were ready and willing to meet and share knowledge with each other. And adding to this willingness to share was the vast amount of knowledge there was to be shared. Think about the pace of change that must have been occurring at the time, but think about it in the context of that time and not time flying by as we know it today. The Industrial Revolution spawned a tremendous growth in information. The huge, vast geography of this country saw the growth of its railroad help create a meetings and convention business. The growth of the railroad made it increasingly easy for people to meet people they didn't know and to see things that were never seen before. The growth of cities, the creation of larger manufacturing organizations, and the pace of change all made it desirable and necessary for people to get together. There were discussions to be had about new techniques, new products to see, new programs about the challenges of organizing a large number of people, all of whom needed to be managed into doing one highly specialized task very, very well. So logically then, the Industrial Revolution was a major contributor as the rise in manufacturing resulted in creating large-scale production at specific sites, which led to the need to create a sales force to market the products. Manufacturers recognized they needed to get their salespeople, who were flung all over the country, together to learn about the new stuff that was being manufactured and all the new rules and regulations they worked under. And the revolution was spawning an amazing new number of products. The people who sold them needed to know what was coming down the line, and the general public needed to know that stuff existed in order to want to buy it. After all, we didn't quite have the option of infomercials just yet. So conventions and meetings really were a revolution in the way information could be created and distributed. From these needs for information and the need for developing and nurturing relationships came that which we know today as trade shows, exhibits, industrial fairs, and things like the Chicago World Fair. Since people couldn't go to all the different companies that were building things, trade shows and fairs were created to bring these things to the masses. At the time of the Chicago fire in 1871, there were fewer than 75 trains leaving Chicago every day. 15 years later, that number had grown to 178 daily departures, along with the addition of over 500 miles of street tracks. Railroads were not only moving goods and products across this continent, now they were moving people, lots of them. And before the railroads, it was very difficult for people to meet in person. Now it was becoming very, very easy. What used to take days and weeks on horseback or carriage or dusty roads could now be accomplished with rail, allowing people to catch a train and travel less than a day to meet with others. It's no accident that the earliest convention cities were those in the Midwest. By 1879, St. Louis had become the third largest city in the U.S., surpassed only by New York and Philadelphia. St. Louis built the first bridge, railroad bridge across the Mississippi in 1874. In the Midwest, people from the major population centers of the country could meet in locations that made it possible for the most people to reach a convention within a very reasonable amount of time. So now on to 1893 and the shape of this country at this time. Let me know if any of this rings a bell. We were in the throes of a depression, and while not one that reached the depths of the one that happened in 1929 or the one that in theory just ended, this country was struggling. We were still recovering from the hangover that was the Civil War, which had ended just 40 years before, a long time by today's pace, but in that time passed very differently. Our means of communicating was limited to newspapers, other traditional publications, good old-fashioned mail, and it had been a very difficult century. Panics in 1819, again in 1837, then the Civil War, now the Panic of 1893. Like most major financial downturns, the Depression of the 1890s was preceded by a series of shocks that undermined public confidence and weakened the economy. In the last days of President Harrison's administration, the Reading Railroad went into receivership. That collapse was soon magnified by the failures of hundreds of banks and businesses dependent upon the Reading and other railroads. The stock market reacted with a pretty dramatic plunge. Fearing further collapse, European investors pulled their funds from the United States, but depression soon gripped the other side of the Atlantic as well. Panic of 1893 was severe, with a run on currency, banks closing, businesses and manufacturers not being able to open because they didn't have the cash to pay workers or buy materials. Like every good panic, there were precipitous declines in the stock market. Wall Street brokerage houses failed, as did 158 national banks, mostly in the Southwest. Financial crisis was preceded by an unexpected event when Baring Brothers, a financial house in London, defaulted on 21 million English pounds of debt, which had been collateralized by its heavy investment in Argentina. So to cover the default, the Bank of England borrowed from the Bank of France, which borrowed from the Bank of Imperial Russia, and in November of 1890, there were numerous bank failures and runs on currency all over Europe as well. Any of that sounding familiar? So in the 100-plus years that have passed since then, a multitude of causes have been said to have contributed to the general disturbance in the markets that occurred in 1893. To many, the primary causes were due to overtrading, unhealthful expansions, investments in speculative securities, and in various forms of corporate enterprises and development in new and untried fields, and in undue expansion of credits by the banks. So now let's go to Detroit, Michigan at this time. Remember again that we were not really an economy of any kind in this country at the time. The reality is, from a historical perspective, we had barely got our feet under us from our independence, and we were still learning to walk following the American Revolution when we found ourselves in a civil war. Our country's economy to that point had been based as much on the economies of war as it was on the economies of agriculture. But all of that was changing. The industrial era had begun. The impact of the Depression on every city in this country was considerable. And as civic leaders were working trying to stabilize their cities, many thought selling their cities through conventions was a solution. The logic was very, very, very simple. In the absolute truest spirit of boosterism, and long before Jim Collins and Built to Last gave us the concept of a big, hairy, audacious goal, they felt that if only people could come and see how wonderful their city was, those people would see the advantage of locating their firms and companies there, thus stabilizing the community's revenues and creating jobs. It was that simple. It's a theory that has stood the test of time very, very well. Once again this year, Development Counselors International, a noted economic development firm, noted in its every other year survey of corporate decision makers, a key influencer in making a decision about where to relocate a company or where to expand a company comes on the heels of their travel experience. Has never left the top sources of influence since the survey began more than 20 years ago. In February of 1896, the Detroit Journal noted the attractiveness of the business of conventions in promoting a city. The article not only pointed out the obvious values of the business to Detroit by the cash expenditures the attendees would bring, but suggested that local businesses band together and organize a formal and strategic promotion of Detroit as a desirable convention destination in a focused way to get more of this business. The article in the paper said, during the past few years, Detroit has built up a name as a convention city. Delegates coming from hundreds of miles, manufacturers holding their yearly consultations around our hotels, and all without any effort on the part of the citizens or any special attention paid to them after they got here. They have simply come to Detroit because they wanted to. Can Detroit, by making an effort this year, secure the holding of 200 or 300 of these national conventions? It will mean the bringing here of thousands of men from every city in the Union, and they will expend millions of dollars with the merchants and the people of the City of the Straits. 2 weeks later, the Detroit Convention and Businessmen's League was founded, comprised of civic leaders, hoteliers, railroad agents, and others simply interested in this idea. Their mission, hustling for all these conventions. They elected that newspaper writer as their first convention secretary. He logged over 17,000 miles in that first year on the job, promoting the prettiest city in the country and its inhabitants as people who vie with one another to entertain the stranger within their gates. Another Detroit Journal article that year noted, when you hear of any concern that thinks of moving, start out to do just one thing: get them to visit Detroit. In that way, Detroit can get plenty of good factories. Make them come, even if you have to go after that. Before Detroit created this first formal organization, there had been a growing number of cities sending their civic leaders out on the road to promote their destinations. Much of the resulting activity came because there were local members of various national organizations seeking to bring their conventions to their hometowns in a true spirit of boosterism, but they recognized there were economic benefits as well. Hoteliers, rail agents, retailers, others were joining the civic salesmen as they began to recognize that attracting visitors to their cities had a number of very real economic advantages. To those civic leaders, the idea of bringing in people to see the greatness of their city was as smart for economic recovery as it was for development strategy. In an early meeting of the Association of Convention Secretaries, it was reported it was a convention held in Detroit, by the way, which was directly responsible for the beginning of the great automobile industry there. The Packard family, who were located in Iowa, attended a convention in the Michigan city and were so favorably impressed that they moved their factory there. In 1916, Fred Butler, the executive secretary of the Jamestown, New York Board of Commerce, wrote, "Conventions have a twofold value. First, there's the money they leave in a city to enter the channels of trade. The second is the advertising value to the city." Butler went on then to create what became known in our world as the Kalamazoo Plan. It's a plan that said everybody in town who benefits from a convention here pays their share of going in. It's what led to the creation of the hotel occupancy tax. So as cities began to compete more and more for these meetings, the product development side of the equation had to catch up as well. Rail lines expanded, highways were developed, cars were becoming available. Location simply was no longer enough. People could now really easily get to a whole lot more places. An early survey in Cincinnati supported the creation of industrial expos to showcase their city, with boosters alongside hoteliers, retailers, and railroad agents championing the cause. Chicago laid the groundwork for this industry in the Midwest when it built the Interstate Industrial Exposition Building in the 1870s. Said to be the nation's first permanent exhibit hall, it celebrated Chicago's resurrection after the fire of 1871 and served as convention center, exhibit hall, and opera house until the 1890s, when it was replaced with the Art Institute, then also used for meetings during the World's Columbian Exhibition. Convention centers would provide a place and reason for non-peak season visitors to come. The bed tax a mechanism government could use to assure everyone in a destination would help pay for the marketing and facilities that would draw people in. Nearly a century later, an important growth point for the convention industry was the recognition of the need for urban renewal in the 1980s to build downtown cores that had deteriorated after the long urban flights of the preceding decades. For many communities, the idea of a convention center was an anchor for redevelopment of an inner city, critical to attracting hotels, restaurants, and the other ideas that were important to replace a decaying area. Convention centers could also provide employment for the people that needed construction jobs and provide an ongoing source of employment after the construction was finished. Urban renewal and community development also come through new infrastructure. And if you've ever been to Baltimore's Inner Harbor or London's Canary Wharf, or even just down the road a little bit in Oklahoma City's Bricktown, you know exactly what I mean. And none of that could have happened without tourism. Economic development fundamentals talk about the role of government in the framework of but for. And but for the involvement of government, state or local, it doesn't matter, much of the things that define our destinations just don't happen. The numbers never work right on convention centers. That's why the private sector doesn't build them. But they're more than happy to come and join the same neighborhood where the convention center is. The same thing goes for stadiums and arenas and art centers and museums. You build them as the driver to stimulate the things that will happen around them. And but for the involvement of all of you in this room, visitors don't happen. Visitors have choices. They don't decide to go to a place they've never heard of. Even business travelers have choices because their CEOs had choices and thus made the decisions about where the business was going to be. And every single one of these visitor types matter. Most of you in this room are in sales directly or indirectly, so you know the old adage about how it's so much easier to keep a customer than to have to go get new ones. The rule is it's usually 5 to 10 times more expensive to go get a new one. And to me, you have a very interesting dynamic here in Norman, because it would seem to me that you lose 25% of your customer base every single year. You're losing 25% of your already aware consumer. You're losing 25% of your would-be evangelists. Now, mind you, they get replaced by another freshman class, but 4 years later, that group, for the most part, is gone. And not many of them stick around here after graduation, right? So you ride this roller coaster up and down for your core visitors and their money here in Norman, friends and family of students, campus-related activity, and all of their spending. And you build to make sure the campus keeps attracting new students and booster dollars. But I think you have to make those same kind of investments happen throughout the community if you ever want to maximize the return on investment of those college recruits. You do an amazing job of getting great, bright, talented kids in here, and then you make them even greater, even brighter, even more talented, and then they leave. And I know some of that is starting to affect change here, and it has to, and I hear it in the leaders you're recognizing today. They see what's possible in a Norman that can and is evolving. Because when the class of 2012 leaves, not only do they take all that educational investment with them, they take their future earnings with them too. So short of coming back here occasionally for a game or a class reunion, they're gone, and you're starting over again. Pittsburgh was dealing with the same thing in the early to mid-90s. Lots of universities churning out lots of bright minds, including local kids, most of whom left, as eventually did many of the companies that had a base of operations or headquarters there because their prospective workforce was leaving. And it wasn't happening just in Pittsburgh, but that's where the aha moment came out of Carnegie Mellon University and a guy named Richard Florida, the originator of the creative class concept, which is all about cities of the future, the needs of the workforce of the future, and what will define their success. One of the core tenets of the creative class is that it's about this current generation of young folks, the type of jobs that have emerged over this generation, and how these things were combining to literally and figuratively transform work, leisure, community, and everyday life. There were fundamental shifts happening all around us, but it was really hard to define. And when 9/11 happened, some things became very crystal clear. Sure, there were dynamics that changed to all of us overnight, very tangible things like airport security and a far greater and more heightened sense of awareness about terrorism on our own soil. But there were some intangibles that took a little longer to define. For many people, but particularly to this creative class, this younger generation, there came this realization that they had been living in a world of their own priorities, their own concerns, with very little regard for others or for more broad social issues. We, the people, had become complacent, aimless, and as Richard Florida stated, discontent at having become so. In Florida's findings, he identified what had become the most dominant class in America, a class whose members were at the power centers of industry, media, government, the arts, pop culture, but none of it really behaving as a known force, a collective he defined as the creative class, and that creative class is your future and mine. I think the first graduate of that creative class was Steve Jobs, and right next to him was Bill Gates. So that class has had the power to reshape our communities and our worlds, and they've begun to do so. They have begun to vote with their checkbooks, but they're doing it via their local passports too. Everybody knows the Starbucks name, right? Where Starbucks evolved in the world of the creative class is that it became as the third place to be, the place that wasn't home and wasn't work, but it was the other place you could be and be you. Are there any Starbucks owners in the room? Okay, let's think about Starbucks, because this is what the business model is built on. Really bad tasting burnt coffee, right? That you doctor and doctor and doctor so that it no longer tastes like bad tasting burnt coffee, and then you pay extra for the privilege of not making it taste like bad burnt coffee. That's how Starbucks' business model works, but how their economic model has worked has been all about becoming this third place to this creative class. And here in Norman, you have invested heavily in the campus through research and development and new facilities and maintained a strong university and thus remained very attractive to a wide range of students. And the U.S. has been right there with you, shifting away from manufacturing and services as the backbone of our economies and moving toward the higher value-added creative sectors. Scientists, artists, software developers, researchers, highly coveted target sectors by your economic development folks. But unlike retaining the manufacturing industries, who could then in essence force the retention of their workforce, this is where the manufacturing plant is, this is where the jobs are, this is very different. Creativity doesn't get passed down from generation to generation. It is in a constant state of evolution, and it lives on a constantly changing playing field. In 1993, economist Paul Romer made this forecast. We do not know where the next major idea about how to support ideas will be, nor do we know where it will emerge. He continued, the country that takes the lead will be the one that implements an innovation that supports the production of commercially relevant ideas in the private sector. Only a failure of imagination, the same one that leads the man on the street to suppose that everything has already been invented, leads us to believe that all of the relevant institutions have also been designed. Richard Florida, with all of his research on consumers and changing behaviors and changing social mores, found in order to sustain this creative class, we had to change how we looked at institutional investments. Historically, government and most large firms tended to make large-scale investments in physical capital. Factories, roads, water systems, airports, schools, you know the drill. These would logically result in increased worker efficiency, thus greater returns on investment. But this creative class, the workforce of our future, the business leaders of our future need and want more. Communities that invest in resources that will expand minds and ideas, some of which may be physical assets, including adult learning environments, or artisan villages. Neighborhoods with new types of home, including for rent, will be in the driver's seat. Build the places the creative class wants to hang out in, and the companies that want to hire them have to come looking. This workforce of the future is something we all have to think about, and unlike the good old days, the generations behind us are making very, very different choices when it comes to career paths. They're not doing what we did. We went where the jobs were, moving about frequently, often because of those. But these next generations are going where they want to live first, and then finding the jobs they can do in those places in order to assure the quality of life they want, which for them is all about the place. The companies that want these kids, they'll find a way to be in the communities where those kids are living, which makes it about us and makes it about our visitors. Because but for us and the visitors we make possible, those quality of life things that make the place in the community simply can't be sustained. But for those visitors, their output represents two things our communities simply cannot live without and can't provide on our own: immediate cash spending and unbiased word of mouth about their experience. And that's what gets us to the OPM, other people's money, OPM. It's the same light that went off for the folks in Detroit. As destination marketers, us folks at the CVB, we have always served the visitor directly through a combination of three of the sectors: informing, educating, and advising, marketing and selling, delivering services. But now we have the opportunity to start servicing the visitor in our communities by developing the destination. And I'm not suggesting that we stop doing any of the selling or any of the marketing and all of those things, but folks, let's face it, as the CVB, we're brokers. We have absolutely no control of inventory, no control of pricing. We can do our very best to bring buyers and sellers together and hope that the time and the price is right for both. We're a consignment store. We are the big lots of the inventory the hotels and attractions don't want and can't sell otherwise. So we get the leftovers, which is fine, we're good with that. But it's why the bigger picture of the CVB's role always has to be about the destination and the community we serve. As CVBs, we collectively have to be a key partner with our community's bigger picture master planning efforts so that visitors and ultimately the money they spend in our communities are capitalized on as integral to the community's overall priorities. And this means for all of you that your visitor goggles have always got to be bifocals and they always have to be on. Development for all the right reasons doesn't have to be a bad word. Development with the visitor's needs at its core, which often mirror many of the community's needs, that's powerful stuff. Who doesn't want more restaurants, more distinctive shops, better neighborhoods, walkable streets? As your community talks about projects, large and small, city-led or private sector-led, put the creative class and your visitors into the discussion. When the conversation leads to green spaces or public safety or transit-oriented development, be there and put on those bifocal goggles. Think visitors, think creatives. When there's a discussion about corridors and accessibility and airport improvements and bike paths, think visitors, think creatives. When there's discussions about development standards and signage ordinances, think visitors, think creatives. It can't and shouldn't always and only happen on campus because it will then always and only be associated with the campus, and all your eggs are in that one basket. And Norman has to be more than that if you're going to capture the hearts and wallets of the brain trust that comes into this town every single year with a freshman class, to capture the human capital that should be your future. Your CVB's responsibilities have Stephen and his crew at Visit Norman juggling a servant's heart in a role that is a blend of a sales and marketing organization within a trade organization, layered with a level of altruism and civic responsibility. And in that, they aren't easily able to occupy a very visible place in the community because so much of what they do happens outside the community. So much of what they need in order to influence more visitors, that lies in your hands. As civic leaders, all of you in this room likely have very little reason, except perhaps for Michael Vance's table, to really care about hotel room nights and hotel occupancy taxes. So I know you're asking yourselves right now, well, what's in it for me? And candidly, you have every right to ask that, but here's what's in it for you. Here's what meets your needs. Here's why it does matter, regardless of the businesses you're in. As the voices of hundreds of local businesses who employ tens and twenties and hundreds and thousands, this industry has a voice that shouldn't be overlooked. Your hotels and restaurants pay property taxes, collect sales and food and mixed beverage taxes. They buy a literal boatload of water and utilities from your municipality annually. And those are dollars that are not easily replaced if those sources go away. And by the way, those very same restaurants are the places you enjoy for a night out on town or Sunday brunch on Mother's Day, and where you bring your customers and your visiting family. And the hotels are the same places you put your customers when they come to town, or you go to escape your own family when they come for a visit. Today's economic landscape requires focus, commitment, and attention from every element of the community, not just the industry, if you expect to protect, maintain, and grow market share. And that includes the development perspective. As this community's leaders, there's a series of questions facing you, all of which can help you define and refine Norman. Who is Norman today? What are you known as? Who do you want Norman to be? What's standing in your way? The competition for visitor dollars is everywhere. Bringing travelers to our communities remains an ideal way to combat economic downturns, and using OPM, other people's money, to sustain our resident coffers and build our communities makes excellent sense. I gave the core of this speech to our Heritage Society last year, and in Irving, they actually get a small portion of the hotel tax. And I reminded them that allocations for historic preservation and museums from the hotel tax have thus far funded 2 museums to date and have served as the seed money for a third, while also maintaining the city's own historic archives. Without those visitors' backs in Irving, there would be, not only would those things not exist, there would also be no Irving Arts Center, and thus no affordable home for the city's 12 resident arts groups, and thus a whole lot less community arts. And just to maintain the same quality of life standards that everyone in our community enjoys, the caliber of services residents get from code enforcement, police, fire, streets, water, animal services, waste management. If you eliminate the general taxes contributed by visitors through their spending, every single household in Irving gets to pay an additional $461 a year in taxes without any increase in services. Now, I don't know a whole lot about Norman, but I'm going to guess that if you surveyed your residents and said, hey, would you be willing to pay $461 more a year in taxes without getting anything extra for it, the answer would likely be a resounding no. Yes, correct? Yes. When visitors come to your town, your highest and greatest purpose, your calling, is to pick their pockets in the most charitable and friendly of ways. Right? Options for restaurants and shopping and picture taking and lodging and souvenirs and experiences that last a lifetime all result in spending and more spending by other people. And we get all those same dollars in taxes out of their spending that you and I pay, but we don't have to school their kids. They hopefully never have a need for our jails and our hospitals while they're here. And somebody else, the place they're staying, is already footing the bill for their water and their pothole repair. What visitors do for all of our communities is deliver a cash to the community immediate return on investment when we take our show on the road in order to bring more travelers to town. But if they have been there, done that, and bought the t-shirt, and there is nothing else for them to do, they're not coming back. They will go where the experience is new and different the next time. I have a mantra that I've distilled from what I see as the opportunity I believe we all have in everything we do to build and sustain visitor revenues for our communities so that we can build and sustain our communities. We want to be a place where people want to live, want to work, want to play. That whole live, work, play thing sounds a little trite on its own, I know, but when you add the want to as an obligation of everyone in this room and an expectation of what we're trying to do big picture, then the weight is on our shoulders to deliver it. The strength and stability of this future for all of us lies in our ability to make the most of those visitors that come to our town, and I believe Detroit was right. There is no one better equipped to do that than this industry, and those of you that play that role of civic leader and booster for Norman in this town. If you build a place people want to visit, you will build a place where people want to live. If you build a place where people want to live, you will build a place where people want to work. If you build a place where people want to work, you'll build a place where business has to be. You build a place where business has to be, you'll build a place where people have to visit. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for inviting me to be part of Norman today, to celebrate National Travel and Tourism Week with you. You have a tremendous team of leaders at Visit Norman, and I thank you for your hospitality. Now go travel somewhere.